Every trainer may have heard this and every client may be thinking it. I'm doing everything right, so why am I not seeing the results? You can cut calories, you can train harder, you can follow the entire playbook. For some reason, your body continues to resist. Maybe it's not your willpower and maybe it's not your program. Maybe it's something much deeper than that, like toxins in your food, your water, your shampoo, even your protein container. My guest today is Dr. Aly Cohen, a triple board certified physician who is exposing how modern life quietly hijacks our hormones, our gut, our sleep, and our results. In this episode, we talk about obesogens, organic food myths, detox symptoms, hormone disruptors, and how to make real progress without living in fear. If you're a coach, a client, a parent, or someone who's just chasing to live healthier, this one will change how you look at everything. Let's get into it. All right, Dr. Cohen, thank you so much for being on today. I've been waiting and anticipating. I've got your book here, and I've got a lot of pages highlighted. Not to mention, it is now kind of a staple in the kitchen, where I keep it as an encyclopedia to make sure that what I'm eating and what our family is eating is the right stuff. But I really want to start off with the fitness track, because in my experience, in my exposure, we have, in the trainer's world and fitness world, we have a lot of clients that go down this pathway of they want to get results. They work so hard, and we're taught that calories in, calories out, that's what counts. And, just moving your body, having a deficit and sweating, and you'll see some results. And too often what I see is sometimes clients are not getting the results, and it's kind of on the coaches to say, well, is the client really doing the work? But then even myself, I've had clients like this, and what we find is, maybe they're not getting results because of something else. And even if they feel like they're doing everything right. So even though we're taught that, you mentioned something in your book about obesogens, and I want you to kind of get into that. But before you get into that, tell everyone like your background, like how you kind of got into this.
Well, I'll try to keep it short, even though it's a long story.
It's an awesome story.
Yeah, it's an organic story. And I mean that really because, so much out of life happens from real turning points, real pivots in your life. And it so happened that was a story of mine. I was practicing rheumatologist, trained in internal medicine, then fellowship in rheumatology. I was in the suburbs, actually on a farm, living with two young kids. And I was very much into health and nutrition and diet, but it was all stuff I had to add into my life, not something I was trained in medical school. As most people know, we don't get a lot of that at all. And my dog, who was 4.5 years old, my firstborn, essentially got sick, and I had no idea. I mean, I just thought he had a sock in his mouth. He's a golden retriever, chews on everything. We'd see it when it came out the other end and keep moving with our two young babies, which we were busy. But it turned out he got sicker, and in a very short period of time, we diagnosed him, the vets, with autoimmune hepatitis, which is really his immune system had been triggered to attack his own liver. Autoimmune hepatitis. And what was so sad and heartbreaking was that here I was, a practicing immunologist, a rheumatologist for humans, and trying to get going in my life and my career. And the dog really had something that not only do dogs not get generally, very rare, but even in golden retrievers, even rare. So it really, perked up my ears having two young kids, that I didn't know where this was coming from. So I started to explore what he was eating. Was it contaminated? What was I feeding him? Was I feeding him water in the farm town that we live in that might have been contaminated? And then therefore we all were contaminated. What about the red toy that's very popular that he had in his mouth all the time, continuously sucking on this with all the mucous membranes and the sensitivity and absorption of the mouth? But at the time, I was just trying to go through all of it, even his flea and tick medication. And long story short, he did end up passing away about 6 months later. But during that time period of heartbreak, it really changed the course of my whole career and my mission in life, to be honest with you. Because, and I didn't realize at that time I was even doing an environmental health survey, which I'm now doing with these books and, all the educational work I do and what I post. And it's about being aware of how the environment actually plays a big role in human health and pet health. And what I discovered about the lack of regulation in all of the thousands of chemicals that are in our personal care products, our textiles, our cookware, in the water system. I didn't even understand how our municipal tap system worked. What are the laws for wells and regulations? What are, allowable chemicals in the food industry? It was so eye-opening. And, it took about 15 years and 2 textbooks and now this consumer book to really feel very confident about messaging and about how even now as a rheumatologist, 22 years under my belt, how that has really played a big role in what I'm seeing in day-to-day practice in terms of the epidemic of immune disorders, autoimmune disorders, food allergies, those type of things, and how that's really related to the chemicals that we have, surrounded ourselves with. So, that's the story. I'm here to share education. I don't sell products. I don't endorse brands. And I think that's important for at least where I'm trying to go with this, which is education, even into schools as well.
So circling back on that, you talk about all these chemicals that are, it's in our water supply system, and may have heard about it, but I think it's bigger than what is on the surface when people hear about it. And, it was interesting to me when I was reading your book about you explaining how these chemicals actually can live in your fat, are stored in your fat, and actually can make you more obese or prevent you from losing the weight that you're trying to lose. So can you explain that process? Like, how does that work, and what are some of those chemicals that you got to watch out for, or where are those chemicals in that food supply or drinking supply?
So this is a really important question now in the world of GLP-1s and, biohackers. I mean, I think one of the pieces that we've missed in the conversation of weight, and I didn't realize this either, was these exposures that happen, many of these chemicals that cause weight gain, and I'll give you those mechanisms in a second, really do love fat. They're lipophilic chemicals, and they get stored in fat often. And this was really discovered. There's researchers that I am, enamored by in terms of my journey. Bruce Blumberg out of University of California, San Francisco, wrote a book about obesogens. And what we really know about a lot of these chemicals is that, they started off basically discovering that they affect hormones in the human body. Okay. That was where 25 years ago, my co-author, Fred Vom Saal, and this small but very mighty group of researchers went against conventional toxicology when they discovered that low level exposures of many common chemicals in our lives actually can affect hormones and the function and how they work and the signaling at very, very, very low doses. So parts per million, parts per billion, parts per trillion. In some instances, the equivalent of 1 drop of the chemical in 20 Olympic-sized swimming pools. That's how small needed, chemical exposure can do to create a physiologic effect that normally would have been predicted and studied at much higher doses. That's traditional toxicology, is the dose makes the poison. It's very linear. The more you're exposed to something, the more likely you're going to have effects from that exposure. I always joke around and say it's like, drinking when you're 21. It's, the more you drink, the more you're going to have those changes. It's very similar to traditional toxicology. But what was discovered was that it's almost a U curve, that at very, very low doses, low exposures, the kind we see every day, actually, you can have some of the same physiologic effects even at the highest doses. And we never were capable of catching those levels. You're only as good as the test that you use, right, in terms of detection. There are things we'll never detect because we don't have the apparatus to do so. But when they discovered this about 25 years ago, it became a huge movement in terms of worldwide science, peer-reviewed studies, and they were called endocrine disrupting chemicals. So endocrine disrupting chemicals I've written about in 2 books previous, and I pull in all the literature, but now I'm looking at how the immune system is directly affected, not just the hormones and the endocrine system, but guess what? They crosstalk. Now back to obesogens. So within this endocrine disrupting chemical group, and there are about 800 definitive endocrine disrupting chemicals out of over 100,000 chemicals that we now know are, in industrial products and clothing and cookware and plastics and cosmetics and food. But out of those 800, they have a very unique property. As I said, they're able to affect hormones. Well, hormones affect fat and fat development and fat breakdown. And some of the chemicals implicated, like tributyltin, is a pesticide that's actually used underneath ships and in industrial usages. But there's other chemicals that were since some other pesticides as well. They have the ability to take stem cells, which are the beginning cells of the human body in terms of where they start from in the bone marrow. And they can turn them, those chemical exposures can turn them into fat cells where they otherwise would have been produced into other red blood cells, white blood cells. They also can change the size of fat cells to be larger. They can also block what's called adiponectin, which is an anti-inflammatory component in the human body. So by blocking, the anti-inflammatory effects, you subsequently have increased inflammation and enlargement of fat cells. So there's several mechanisms that have been described. And so we know that many of these chemicals can now do that. Since that time, perfluoralkyls have been associated with being obesogenic. BPA, which is the most well-studied chemical that originated back 25 years ago, that's now implicated as an obesogen. And really, as we're looking more into this, many of these chemicals have those effects. So it makes really good sense if that's your goal, is to lose weight or at least maintain weight. If that's a concern, it's everything you said: diet, nutrition, calories, and thinking about it. I would also very much argue that the quality of the foods and drinks that we eat, meaning the least amount of chemicals that are synthetic, processed, ultra processed, even pesticides on whole fruits and vegetables, those are particularly a problem when it comes to trying to either lose weight or maintain weight. And that's been an ongoing issue in our industry, in the food industry.
Is it only the pesticides and insecticides and those things that you're seeing that are, maybe you're using on your lawns, or the things you explained that are on the ships, or are they in products that you might actually ingest through food, which is you might be thinking you're eating healthy and you're actually also ingesting some of those chemicals that would otherwise actually make you increase the number of fat cells in your body?
Yeah. So great question. These chemicals are really all around us, but some of the more, well-known would be, say, canned foods. So BPA, or bisphenol A, is one of the many bisphenols out of the class of bisphenols. It was removed from plastic baby bottles in 2012. There was enough data to show its ability to affect hormones in babies. So it was actually removed. It's one of the few chemicals that have ever been removed from the U.S. market, only about 10 in the history, like DDT, the PCBs in the oceans now, but used to be part of the electrical systems that made their way in the ocean. But BPA is a classic plasticizer chemical, one of the most well-studied, one of the earliest ones. And what it does is it's basically lining the interior of every canned food. Very few exceptions, but it's an epoxy resin lining. And it was designed through the food packaging industry to keep food and drinks in cans from touching the metal walls. There was, concern over botulism when the can is dented to get infection with botulism. And, maybe for good reason, what have you. But again, intention really was to protect us, but it turned out to be after the fact that the testing showed that it has this ability to increase, fat cells and affect fat loss. But also a whole host of other things. Bisphenols are implicated in a whole bunch of stuff, including, hormone changes with thyroid, growth and development, infertility, male genitalia to mothers that have been exposed as well, but also the immune system in terms of inflammation. And so the punchline is not to freak out.
Right. Yeah.
It's to really say, well, what are the alternatives? And everything I describe, which may scare the bejeebers out of everybody, could have a really simple hack. And that's what all of my work is. It's like, here's the problem. But guess what? You've got all these solutions. And one of them would be to swap and, do either fresh produce and wash off residues from pesticides. It would be frozen USDA organic, which is a remarkable hack because not only do you have this USDA certification that's the only food regulation that actually has any value, believe it or not, but frozen produce actually locks in all of those nutrients that get lost for conventional non-frozen when it travels long distances to supermarkets. So there's all these.
Do they get denatured by any way, like when they're frozen because I know when you cook it, you're denaturing some of the value of those food particles that exist in the food. So that could be any of the nutrients or minerals or, the proteins. Does that happen when you're freezing it?
As far as I know, it does not. In fact, if anything, if it's done properly, you're not going to have that problem. When you freeze something too low in terms of temperature, I'm sure the potential's there, right? We've all seen sort of like frozen foods that look a little off when you take them out of the freezer because the temperature was too cold. It formed icicles and perhaps that was more of an issue. But as far as I know, I've never seen studies that show that there's, a reduction of phytonutrients and antioxidants from freezing. And as you said, you can certainly denature those compounds when you're heating them, and which is why steaming is also a very good way to cook food, or stir frying as opposed to, other really high temperature components.
I brought two things here. So this is sardines in oil. And I'm assuming this is probably not safe to eat at this point.
It's not what? Not
safe to eat. It's safe to eat, but maybe the lining on the inside is not safe. Is that
it depends because some of them, I'm assuming that it has some plastic epoxy resin because it has to really protect the food interior. Some of these cans will say BPA free, which unfortunately in a world where they're always trying to whack-a-mole and create what's called a regrettable substitution. BPS has since been added to products that have no allowance for BPA, BPSIP. And I talk about this in the book. It's kind of a chemical industry. Yeah, that's how they get around these issues. Now, I will say this, Michael, and I talk about this throughout the book, and you're looking at me with colored hair right now, right? Life is not about perfection. Life is not about, having done this work for so long, I can tell you there's risk benefit for all of these choices. And if you're talking about sardines, which are incredibly nutritious, that have not only great deal protein, that have omegas that are small in size where they don't bioaccumulate heavy metals and PCBs and microplastics up the food chain, you're talking about a really healthful choice if you do not have a glass container of sardines, so in other words, if you don't have perfection, it doesn't mean you give up on it. And I think that's a really important message. I have, single-use plastic, organic fruit all the time, because I'm running to the supermarket. I don't grow my own food. If I go to a farmer's market and I don't need those single-use plastics, that'll be great, right? But in general, I have to take what the system and my life has right now for me and access. So I just want your listeners to think like, oh yeah, there's some negative stuff here, but guess what? Everything is about making reasonable choices with what you have, not going for perfection, and to do this as a journey over time because it really is a journey. I'm still learning. I just swapped out my dishwasher detergent because I realized it wasn't at the best I could find. And now there's better choices. So there's every day is a reason to consider change, but not to freak out.
So this one is okay. Probably.
Yeah. I mean, if you have those two choices and you're choosing glass over an aluminum or stainless steel can that might have packaging related exposures, yeah, I think that's a great choice.
And then, back to the point that you were making about the organic foods, because I want to touch on that for a second. I happen to be somewhat involved on the side of importing foods from different countries. And maybe some of the listeners know this, maybe they don't, but there's a high percentage of foods, fruits, primarily, and vegetables that are imported into the U.S. And they're labeled as organic, but to your point, they may use a different organization to measure whether or not it's organic or how they measure what their metrics are of measurement. And That other group is called APHIS, and there's a couple others from a few other countries. But even to your point, like FDA on this specific can, right? They might ban BPA, but then they just switch over to something else because they got to get around it. Mm-hmm. And I see that kind of same thing happening on the import side on USDA. Like they say, hey, this is not acceptable, and then so they just swap it out for something else. The other thing, when items are brought into the U.S., even though they're labeled as organic, we might end up seeing those same products are then treated afterwards. And the treatment is because of other pests of concern that come over into our country, and we got to make sure that the food is safe. So we'll treat it with methyl bromide, which is also not very healthy or safe for us. So how do you make those decisions? To your point, you can't go into your backyard and like grow. For a lot of people, if they don't have a yard, they might live in a city. It's really hard to grow everything yourself and have total oversight and control over it. I was looking, you made some mention in your book about foods that you might see at Whole Foods. I can't remember if it was a food or it was an item, but even those items and foods that are in grocers that you would think, this is a safe choice, it's a healthy choice, Trader Joe's, Whole Foods, you get into a position where you still have to kind of question. So is there like a quick checklist on how you can just go, do these three things, or, like a mnemonic that you use to like go through the process of handling how you're making purchasing decisions for your family and yourself?
Yeah, I didn't come up with a mnemonic in regards to that because there's so much variability in the food packaging industry and what people are prioritizing. But I will say, if I were to think about it, when I go into a supermarket, assuming that I'm not able to go to the farmers markets that are wonderful this time of year, there's organic and non-organic. You can certainly buy non-organic foods and wash them with 1 part baking soda, 3 parts clean water, or 1 part white vinegar and 3 parts or 4 parts clean water. So those are do-it-yourself food washes, food scrubs, agitating them and getting off pesticides where you might not have access to organic. And I want to validate that because it's not all about, again, USDA organic across the US where there might be food deserts. Right. But when I go into a store, I look at the packaging as a really key part of what my options are, because I think it's one of the pieces that's probably missing in most people's equation of what's healthy or not. As you probably saw, I have a food pyramid, the Detoxify Food Pyramid. And it was really a take on Andrew Weil's anti-inflammatory sort of Mediterranean food pyramid. His is anti-inflammatory food pyramid. And then Mark Hyman's is vegan. And I kind of thought, well, what do I believe? What do I think, given what I know and I've studied? And I put on the bottom, number 1, detoxification processes along the bottom of my pyramid, because I think that's something we really want to be thinking about before heading into any other decisions. The next layer up was food packaging, again, because it's such a big contributor to chemicals into our food system and our drinks that we don't pay attention to. And what are the pros and cons of each of those images in the pyramid? And then above that is drinking water. And drinking water, I think, is so important because we really don't talk about that. And we will hopefully get into that a little bit. And then the rest is Mediterranean diet. And along the side is really organic as a preference if it's available. And that whole pyramid to me emphasizes quality over macros. Quality over how much protein you eat or fats or carbs. I mean, I'm all into that too. I'm an athlete and I run every day and all that. But I think that if you're having a big, huge kale salad that's not organic or hasn't been washed appropriately to remove many of those pesticides, then you're really getting a load of chemicals into your gut that is working against you, or at least, net is neutral and doesn't help you because you're not only going to have microbes that are getting knocked off by the pesticides, you're not only going to affect your immune system at the gut level, but you may actually have lower level of nutrients from that non-organic, kale salad. So again, the next layer beyond eating McDonald's and Wendy's and all that to go to unprocessed foods is a huge lift for a lot of people. And then I'm hoping people will take another step into the quality of even those foods as well. And I think that's where the journey is.
In talking through this pyramid, and then thinking about the chemicals that you're you might be ingesting or you might be around those environmental factors. One area that I read in your book, you had mentioned something, and I had it highlighted here, and I was trying to find the page, but you had talked about the only two things that the FDA has ever identified as being a true cancer risk or true health risk, and that was smoking, and what was the other one? Alcohol?
UV light. And
UV light.
UV light is skin cancer risk. And then I think you can now argue there's enough data that I didn't put in there, but alcohol as an contributor to cancer risk. But yeah, those are those kind of one-to-one, where we've had enough years and enough science to argue this is a pretty real thing in humans, not just animal studies and in the lab. Mm-hmm.
So with that, right, that's something that we know, it's definitive, and the other components aren't. And to your point, it's really hard to kind of test that in humans. Like, let's say this chemical, let's tease this chemical out and see if this person is susceptible to it and if it actually causes cancer. Right? There's just there's no human on this planet that would want to do that. And plus, it's like super hyper illegal. So knowing that you can't like tease that out, and that our life expectancy has increased over the years. Right? Every year, over a year, like we continue to increase our life expectancy. Is it possible to theorize that maybe we just kind of live with these things and that our body adjusts to this, living with all these chemicals inside our body, and because we continue to have a longer lifespan, and we just kind of excrete them out when the time is right, when we're trying to cleanse our body.
Right. So I will say to a lot of those points. So number one, we're living perhaps longer, but we're living sicker. If you look at health outcomes in the United States compared to around the world, we are about 37th. I think it was either 35th or 37th in terms of health outcomes. And yet we spend the most money on healthcare than any other country in the Western world. So we really are sicker humans. We're living longer because we have certain technology and we have certain medications, but it doesn't mean we're living well. We're not living with quality lives. We're going to doctor's appointments. We're taking upwards of anywhere between 4 and 9 medications after a certain age group per day.
Wow.
So we are filled with polypharmacy and obesity. The diabetes issue is real. We have 60% of the U.S. population.
It hasn't changed in many years.
What'd you say?
It hasn't changed in many years. Like that 60% number has, I think, been there for like the past 10 years, which is awful.
I mean, we're now moving into demographics of younger demographics. We're getting even younger. If you want to argue that we're expanding how many people are becoming pulled into that 60%, even though their percentage is still, moving into younger age groups. So we have children that are really, starting off at 6, 7, 8, 9 with morbid obesity. So, here's the thing. Our bodies are not good entirely. It depends on the class. Remember, there's over 95 to 100,000 chemicals. That is a lot of science from academic centers that needs to be sussed out. It's so slow and painful. They need NIH grants. They need funding because manufacturers are not, and I repeat this, required to test for safety or toxicity of any of the compounds they create before they go into these products that we use in our everyday lives. Cosmetics chemicals, personal care chemicals, cleaning chemicals, textiles, flame retardant chemicals, nonstick chemicals, stain guard chemicals, industrial chemicals for buildings. So if you think about those thousands of chemicals that are allowed to go right into the market that get absorbed into our bodies because they can be found in blood, in urine, in breast milk. And the fact that we can excrete some of them faster than others has a lot to do with the property of the compound itself. Perfluoroalkyl chemicals, which are in all of the fire retardant chemicals, military gear, those take years to get out of our bodies and also out of the environment. But BPA comes out of our bodies within about a 6 to 8 hour period. That's half-life in terms of, each successive half. So there's properties that change how we excrete them. There's mixtures, which is that we're not walking around with just one chemical exposure at a time. We're really exposed all the time by lots of different chemicals for different reasons of our lives, what we eat, where we travel, all of that, what we breathe in, that kind of thing. So the big point of the book and my work is not to say, we're going to get rid of all these chemicals. Okay. You read this book and you're going to be clean as a whistle. By no means. What I'm trying to share with people is that by method of precautionary principle, and what we now know, by the way, from animal studies and occupational studies, where you see migrant farm workers and we test them and their children and see what pesticides actually do at high levels because they are exposed, or, people in factories working with vinyl chloride and they have higher levels of hepatocellular cancers. We know that there are definitely human exposures at high doses and, repetitive, consistent exposure that will be much more prone to cancers and other health issues. But the low levels are still there, and they're still changing the numbers epidemiologically. Now we have 7 to 14% of the U.S. population that has at least one autoimmune disease, which is unheard of.
Wow.
And this is really critical because we're not excreting these chemicals the way we think we are, because we're not exercising and sweating. We're not sleeping really great sleep that washes many of these chemicals, as I talk about in the book. We have a wash system, actually. We're not having the cruciferous vegetables and all of these unbelievable nutrients that we can see make a dent in terms of these exposure risks and we change, how our genes are expressed. You mentioned something, you were kind of alluding to the fact about who gets cancer and who doesn't. And how do you know this? Well, listen, it's a dance between our genetic predisposition, our lifestyle, and our exposures. And to be able to control at least two of those three things is the goal. To be able to reduce those exposures, you're essentially changing the destiny of your health, because we know that when you reduce exposures, there's less in your body, and that means less likely to make those changes to your immune and endocrine system. So, it's practical stuff. But it has to be thought through in a reasonable way without losing your mind, given the fact that it's a big problem.
So for most of us, we really don't know how good we really could feel, right? We're just kind of living with this toxic environment and really a kind of a toxic body if we're not paying attention to things. And we're in a position where we think, well, maybe I feel fine, but we don't know what the optimal feeling of good should be. Would you say that's probably an accurate assessment of how most of us are kind of like meandering through our life?
Yeah. And I even have cases in the book. Massimo is one of the cases who was an actual patient, not the same name, but he, came in with fatigue. It was otherwise a little overweight, no major health chronic conditions that he was aware of, and, came in really just not feeling great. And it was fatigue. And I talk about through the book how, using medical training that you're working through, thyroid conditions and nutrition, like vitamin D levels can create fatigue, and, infectious history like Epstein-Barr, all these things that can contribute to fatigue. And what for him worked best was working through all of that, repleting, getting in back the nutrition his body was craving, that the human body has needed for millions of years in a reasonable way. And then also working on one of the most important chemicals that he was exposed to and had high levels of. Not that I test everybody, but for his case, it was very pertinent, given that he worked in a pizza parlor and he was handling, all of these grease-proof wrappers and boxes that are recycled, and his levels were off the chart. And so the idea was that by putting in some couple fixes, not changing his job, not quitting, not moving to another country, just by putting in some fixes, he really started to feel better. And I think not that you have to pick up this book or watch anything I do in terms of being a sick person yourself, but I certainly encourage it, or even in remission from cancers. We want to stay out of cancer, right? But also the people that are having low level, symptoms that really aren't, affecting their lives in a huge way, but is certainly part of their lives, and then preventing what could happen down the line, which is happening younger now. So, I encourage people to think about their journey, but where they want to intervene and why and how it means something to them to do that.
Have you thought about, or are you doing kind of like this mass research study? Because the time and energy that you've put into this, I would have to think that you kind of can build a case around a lot of this. I mean, certainly you've done that, right, through all of the other research that you've done, but with your own patients.
Yeah.
Patients that are coming in and you have these markers that specifically show this is what it was that was causing this problem. And now things are better. And then now those levels are not like they used to be from those tests. Are you building that, or could you be building that? And if you did, would it even have any weight? Would it hold weight in trying to like maybe remove some of these things from our environment, or pull some weight where lawmakers are saying, hey, we have to get rid of this too, and it can't be in our food and it can't be in manufacturers' hands?
Well, guess what? These studies have actually already been done. That's why I pull them into these books. I look at all the studies that switch from a non-organic to an organic diet measure, chemical reduction. It doesn't necessarily pull into each individual test study and test subjects' feelings of how they feel. But the studies that I pull in are the ones that have been well done, peer-reviewed, overseen by a medical board, published in the right journals that have, authority in terms of their science and reproducibility. Your point is, really well taken. But what I see in a small practice that I've been able to keep reasonably small because of all the other work I have and 2 children and life and aging parents and everything else, it wouldn't even add value in terms of what's already been done around the world. I mean, it's such an important message. It is just not visible because most people don't get smacked in the face from their day-to-day life, right? They don't necessarily have a rash or a food allergy reaction. These are very subtle, insidious exposures. But if you were to test blood and urine, you would absolutely see these levels are present. Are they present in every person in enough of amount to cause disease? We don't know that. Everyone has a different threshold as a human being, but we know in animal studies, in controlled environments, that these chemicals have their own profile of what they can do in terms of risk. And we need to take that and say, listen, we have enough data to make reasonable changes. We don't have to overhaul everything, but we want to be thinking about filtering our water. We want to think about, on a regular basis, what do we buy for our homes and our family, and what do we eat? Not when you travel, not when you go to, a football game, not when you go to a birthday party. I'm very reasonable about that. It's really the 80-20 rule for me. And when we put that into real play, you start to see benefits that you may never have expected. Weight loss, perhaps, maintenance of weight, staying out of cancer, if you're in remission and you're managing that. These chemicals are inflammatory. These chemicals affect hormones. They affect growth and development. They affect fertility. We know we have a big infertility problem. And it's not just because we're good at diagnosing these things anymore, because we have less time with our doctors. So this is real stuff that's happening. And I'm encouraging really for people to do this on their own, not wait for regulation, as we were talking about, taking out one dye, red dye number 3, taking out a couple chemicals, from that very limited Safe Drinking Water Act that we still follow in this country from the 1970s, which is so limited. It's crazy. Waiting for all those changes is not going to happen in the course of a lifetime where it matters to our health. And so I've always said, don't wait for anyone to save us. Let's do it ourselves in a very, very simple way.
And I think the key there too is if enough people take action on wanting to stray away, these manufacturers, their bottom line is going to be affected, right? That because more people are going away from maybe these canned goods, and now manufacturers are having to do glass goods. It forces them to go, okay, well, we got to rethink how we're selling because consumers now are not purchasing it. I think that beats the lawmakers, right? Because
literally, Mike, over the last 15 years of doing this work, I have seen enormous change in the market. People are demanding cleaner food, cleaner beauty care, cleaner cleaning products. We're going back to what grandma used with vinegar and Castile soap and, lemon juice and, coarse salt for scrubbing. We don't need 20 different cleaners in our house: doorknob cleaner, surface cleaner, oven cleaner, carpet cleaner, window cleaner. I mean, if we just sit back and look at what we buy because of the marketing pressure, we've been, we could make so much, strides and save money by not even buying half the junk that we bring into our home, and thinking about air quality and not buying air fresheners, which are loaded with phthalates that have enormous effect on health, endocrine and otherwise. We need to just step back and say, how do we become more anthropologically sound? Why don't we go back to where we had, a whole host of different habits before we were marketed to? That's the first step with anything, is assess and pull these out of our lives. Think if we want to swap or just, reduce. And that's part of the 4 A's of environmental health navigation that I put in the book as well. Very simple plan, is to really think about where you're at to start with and how do you peel these away. And then the third A was assess, which we have a 50 question, very reasonable survey. You add up the points and see where you start. The second is avoid or swap, which is that conversation of, do we really need this stuff, and how much? And if we do, what's a safer product? And the third A is add. So it's what do we add into the human body that it's needed for millions of years? Nutrition, fiber to bind a lot of these chemicals in the gut. We need compounds that we know offset some of the epigenomic changes that have been seen in these chemical exposures, right? Transgenerational effects between one generation and the next, they carry through. Sweating, natural physiology of the human body, kidney support, lymphatic system support, movement, sleep, which is incredible for washing out a lot of these chemicals. So adding that in is really important, not just taking away chemicals. And then the fourth A is why my hair is colored, is because it's it's life. It's the lacrosse practice and games I have to go to for the next 4 weeks straight. And it's basically the toxic turf that you can't avoid, but you want your kids to be happy, and you're going to wash after you go, and you're going to use soap and water to wash off all the petroleum-based chemicals from tire crumb. So there's a hack and there's an allow into all of this so that we can live and make our way through this.
Are some people more susceptible, like some genes turn on and others off, because they're predispositioned for it? So like maybe for you for example, right, you can put that on your hair and it's not going to affect you ever, right? Maybe you don't know that.
We'll see. I don't know yet. Right. The jury's out on that. Here's hoping. But like to your point, there's some really great science that I wrote a lot about in my second book, Non-Toxic, where we were talking about Parkinson's disease. Actually, it was even in the first book, the textbook written by one of the neurologists that was part of it. There are certain predispositions. Yeah, that's the second book. Thank you. And then the first book is a textbook in the Andrew Weil academic series, and that had 26 contributing authors, one of which was a brilliant neurologist, and he had done the research on what we know about chemicals that predispose you to Parkinson's disease, and that there's a whole set of genes. Now, the thing is that that's not practical in conventional medicine. We haven't gotten to a place where that's a test you walk into LabCorp or Quest and can get. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of variability on those studies, but there's no question most people would argue, almost every appropriate, medical journal and, physicians would argue that predisposition is not identifiable yet. We also are kind of mutts from our parents, right? So by the time we figure out our parents' genetics and predisposition, we're getting a mix of both of those, right? So we're not there yet, but there's no question you can offset the harm of changing your gene expression by lifestyle. And lifestyle has been shown to affect those proteins that sit on top of genes and either allow them to express into a disease or not. We have control over those proteins. We're not going to change our genes or sequence, but we can change the proteins that sit on top. Those are modifiable by lifestyle and exposures. And that's the argument here, is taking steps so that we can reduce that risk, even if we don't know hard and fast what our predisposition is.
Can you reverse some of those effects? So like you mentioned some chemicals that are linked to Parkinson's and are linked to Alzheimer's. Can you, let's say you got to a certain point, can you reverse it? Or is it just like, now that you have Parkinson's or Alzheimer's, now you have it, like there's no undoing it, but it becoming more progressive, you can at least slow it down?
It's a great question. It's reminding me of one of my guests for my own podcast, for The Smart Human. It was he's a breast surgeon who did incredible research on breast tissue over his course of being a breast surgeon, very well known. William Goodson. That interview is amazing. And what he did, and I'll tell you quickly, is that he, he's retired now, but one of his best incredible studies wasn't that long ago. And he had 28 volunteers. They were women who were very related to women with breast cancer. So they were very emotionally connected to this research, but they themselves had not been diagnosed with any cancers. And he did 29, he had 29 participants, and he did fine needle biopsies of their breast tissue. And then they changed out all of their personal care products to safer choices over the course of a month. And then all 28 showed up for a repeat fine needle biopsy voluntarily. And what his research showed is that the signal towards the development of cancers, which a little too in depth to go into here, and even it's very confusing, but essentially had reduced based on their new usage of different products that were safer.
How long was the period?
Just a month.
Wow.
A month of changing out cosmetics and personal care products, which by way of, the fact that most women use on average around 12 products per 24 hours. Teenagers use upwards of 17 products per 24 hours. But he had this incredible data. It made a lot of attention for a short period of time. But it was the first study that's been done in the US. They've been doing it in Europe a little bit more than they have it here in terms of actual tissue samples. But that was such a remarkable study, which you're not necessarily changing your genes, but kind of sort of, yeah. I mean, the signal for cancer development decreased. And so you're not changing the genes, but perhaps the epigenome, which is the, turning into a clinical disease. I thought it was remarkable. And guess what? It took no effort whatsoever to switch those cosmetics and personal care products to safer products. So to me, that's this incredible, benefit to risk ratio that's worth it. And I talk about all of those simple, practical, cost-effective, low-energy swaps that potentially can do the same thing in terms of lowering risk.
So two other things I have for you, because I know we're cutting short on time here. I have this kind of thought, I could be wrong, but I think that maybe the pharmaceutical companies don't really like your practice very much because you end up treating before you're prescribing and not the other way around. And so you get to the root of it, right?
I try.
Yeah. For some of these practices that are opening up, functional medicine, which you don't really, there may be some carryover, but you don't necessarily fall into that category. It's more integrative. And I see a lot of functional medical physicians. They will prescribe, mainly because it's a business. And then you look at these things like TRT, or they'll do some hormone replacement, and they'll do maybe semaglutide for weight loss. Are they potentially doing more harm than good in those scenarios, right? Someone just comes in and they say, I want to lose weight, and like, that's it. Yeah. And then they just give them what they are asking for, or they're wanting to increase their testosterone levels, or for women in the same boat, right? They want to balance out their hormones. So they just kind of give them what they feel is right.
Right.
Or an
I can't, right? Michael, great question. I can't speak to everyone's the way they practice. I really can't. I mean, I think that you're absolutely right. You have to make a living when you leave conventional Western medicine if you're not working salaried for, an institution. There's a lot of what you can do based on fear of a patient's, fear can make you do a lot of things that are not so laden with integrity. We're also swayed by the needs of our patients who want to look better and want to feel better and want to lose weight. I can't speak to all the different practitioners. What I have found, having worked and trained in functional and integrative medicine, along with being, of course, a conventional Western rheumatologist, is that we can swing the opposite way. You can go get so frustrated from Western medicine and not having been satisfied from what you're looking for, into the hands and arms of wellness industry that can take advantage of you in similar ways. The general rule for me is know your practitioner, get a good sense of integrity, understand how much they're testing. I find that testing is way overblown in most cases in the wellness industry. I'm not saying which ones, I'm not talking about which practitioners, but in general, I think there's too much testing and not enough money spent on the solutions, on really buying the $275 reverse osmosis water filter, which is very aggressive at cleaning water. And then you don't have to spend $800 to see what's in your body because we're all contaminated. Save your money. Just put it into the doing, the buying of the better, cleaner food, getting a massage, getting a better mattress so your sleep is better, buying that filter, getting therapy, getting traditional Chinese medicine and acupuncture. I mean, there's so much more we could do with our money. There are certain cases, obviously, of exposures that really need to be taken seriously, and that's a whole different level. But I think in general, what we need to do is really know who our messenger is, see who that messenger hangs out with. I probably have 24 doctors that I really trust and who I follow on Instagram and who I'm, conscious of and think thoughtful about. There's a lot more that I don't know about, but certainly the ones that I've come across and worked with. So it's a tricky business and people are not feeling well and they're sick. So I understand the frustration, but you have to find your way to people and not react from an instinct perspective, and take anything off of TikTok seriously. And some of this stuff is really scary.
Take the test in the book, right?
Yeah, take the test in the book, and there's it's a survey, on not only what you're exposed to, but there's a symptom tracker, pre and post 21-day plan, which I hope people will check out because the 21-day plan is very reasonable. Gets people started. It's not perfection, but it gets people really started in a good way, in a healthy way. So yeah, I hope people will check it out and, not need to go to a practitioner so quickly, perhaps. Maybe this is how I'm scaling the work that I do in a way that can reach more people to avoid having, other, expenses and bad outcomes.
I want to leave everyone with something that they can take away with, if they don't get a chance to purchase the book. I think this is definitely something that you just really should have and have it, in your home, not stored on a bookshelf, but use it as a reference. But if they don't get the book, right, and they just want to take action, we didn't get a chance to talk about water, and I think that is a really critical one because it's one of the major pieces. But
it's in the book, there's a whole wonderful chapter on water that I think goes deep dive, so that'll be good if people are interested.
What 3 things can they do when they're listening here to go ahead and make changes in their lifestyle or in their environment to see maybe the biggest impacts?
Number 1, don't buy junk you don't need. Anything that has colors, fragrances, things that you can avoid personal care and cleaning and clean those up. Those are super high yield and cost effective. Number 2, consider strongly the quality of the food you eat and try to swing into USDA organic if it's available, or at least wash produce whenever you can with the right ingredients of, vinegar and baking soda, those kind of things. Third thing is certainly water filtration. It's a little bit more of a lift for some, but it's not expensive anymore to get really high quality water filter in your kitchen sink, under your kitchen sink, on it, whatever, not necessarily a whole house filter. I say start simple, and that's the highest yield in terms of water consumption through cooking and drinking. So I say start there. Those are the biggies. Cleaning, pans, pots and pans, get rid of nonstick pan. It's not good for, just stainless steel, glassware, carry your water in stainless steel and glass, materials that don't break down and leach in terms of microplastics and chemicals. So those right there are a bunch of things people can do right away. But, I want people to know the why and certainly layer in more stuff if they're interested.
Yeah. Thank you so much. It's been, there is so much more. I told you at the beginning of the show that this could be a very long show, but I think we'll just have to have you back on.
I appreciate it.
Yeah, because there's so many more topics to cover. But more importantly, where can everyone get a hold of maybe some information if they're looking for a free resource or a tool that they can get, which we'll go ahead and put in our show notes here.
I appreciate
and where can they find you and follow you so they stay educated and they actually can, take this and maybe educate others, right? Bring them back into the fold.
Yeah, sure. So I'm on Instagram, The Smart Human with Dr. Aly Cohen, Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, thesmarthuman.com. Thesmarthuman.com has courses if people are interested in a little deeper dive on heavy metals or EMF radiation or the detox information, I have a really nice little mini course on that and others to come. It's called the Smart Human Academy from thesmarthuman.com. And my podcast, The Smart Human, I interview researchers and physicians that I trust, that I believe are really have great information to share that they might not otherwise be able to share, if they're researchers and stuff like that. But certainly I'm in Princeton, New Jersey, alycohenmd.com if people are interested in coming here to see me, or I do telemedicine.
Oh, that's beautiful. Everyone, thank you for listening. And Dr. Cohen, I really appreciate your time. And I'm looking forward to having you on that next episode.